6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, two or more, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." God, I love Peter. While he was still speaking, that would be Peter running his mouth, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." It's the word of God for us, the people of God, and we say, thanks be to God. This is one of those passages that is quite entertaining for me. The very simple version of this sermon is Peter's over his head. He thinks the angels are coming down from heaven. He's celebrating what the Jews referred to as the Festival of the Booths, where the generals would sit at the top of a mountain, and the angels would come down and destroy everything and reestablish the Jewish kingdom. So Peter's super excited about, let me build some booths for you guys, and I'll stand up here while the complete destruction of Rome happens right in front of me. And he can't even get all of the dribble out of his mouth before God tells him to sit down, because you're not understanding what's happening in this particular place. I identify with Peter a lot. That would normally be the sermon topic, and we would discuss it, except 1923, 1934, and 1945. 2018, 2024, and 2029. These are the only dates in the past couple hundred years that both Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day show up at the exact same time. It's a very rare occasion. And if you try to Google sermon resources, you'll notice that the internet predates, that those dates predate a lot of the internet. It's a rather interesting and dichotomous day. As one priest put it, "I can see where people struggle. Do you fast or do you eat your chocolate?" And it's true, but isn't that the human condition? So might I offer something? That this too shall pass. This too shall pass. There was a video that I found fascinating because I find him fascinating, and that was Tom Hanks. They've been doing these very creative things where they get a bunch of actors who have seen a lot, have been through a lot, and we know them because they're famous, but they weren't always famous. They were doing commercials, or they would do ridiculous things just to pay their rent before they got a role. And they have a very good perspective, I believe, on career and family and regret, because they live in the hottest of limelights. Especially today, where everybody has a phone and everybody knows what everybody else does. And he said something very telling, because I believe he's one of the most grounded people that there are in Hollywood, if there is such a thing as a grounded person in Hollywood. And he told the story of this too shall pass. And he said, look, when I first started out, I was a nobody, and I had very tough gigs, and I didn't get paid a lot. And you know what? This too shall pass. And then I got to be famous, and I did a couple of movies, and I was really excited, and everybody loved me. And you know what? This too shall pass. And then he did this movie called Volcano Joe or some such thing, right? It was like, what is... It's a horrible flop. And nobody wanted him, and nobody picked up the phone, and nobody thought he was a good actor anymore. And you know what? This too shall pass. And then he got a few roles, Forrest Gump type things, that then all of a sudden, oh, this guy can act again. And I was fascinated because not that he wasn't a smart guy, but he clearly got this from somewhere. Fascinatingly enough, it's Persian. It's ancient Persian. It's a Persian allegory that's also been connected with Solomon. And the Jews have kind of a side story, if you will, of Solomon and having this wisdom being passed down. And the reason how Tom Hanks found out about it is because a guy named Edward Fitzgerald wrote a modern-day allegory of this, of Solomon and a particular person. And the King Solomon in Fitzgerald's allegory essentially asks the wisest people in his kingdom, look, I would like to have a ring. I want a signet that when I'm sad, I want it to make me happy. Of course, they sat around and tried to figure out how to make this happen, and they gave him a ring, and inside the ring was an inscription, "This too shall pass." It's usually found in wisdom literature. It even gets kind of snuck in a little bit in 1 Peter, same Peter. After you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to this eternal life with Christ, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. AKA, this too shall pass. It shows up in wisdom literature, normally by people who have a long lens to look back, to not get too hot or too cold, to have a bit of balance, to recognize that things, while they seem to be catastrophic, in some ways do have a way of passing on. I'm sure all of you have stories where while you were in the midst of something that you thought was going to be something that it didn't turn out to be, after you moved past it went, it really wasn't that bad. Or perhaps, oh, that was really bad. But it also passes. It also has a tendency to become less powerful over time. It's a very fascinating individual. He wrote a song. His name's David Wilcox, about, 14 years ago. He wrote a song, and it's quite an amazing piece of art. Because it's not just a song. See, he had several failed relationships. Several. As most people with failed relationships go, the next one's the most exciting one because you start wondering, well, how's this one going to end up? Except in his particular case, there might have been a pattern as to why all of his relationships failed, and he recognized that there was a particular pattern. And so he and his particular person that he wanted to go out with went out on a date. And she asked him, said, so clearly you're not in a relationship now. She asked the best question one could ever ask. I need to write this down and hand this off to my offspring because it's a really good question. So how did all of your previous relationships end? I'd kind of like to know that. Because clearly you're not in one now, so what happened? And in the midst of the moment, he decided that, well, she was going to find out sooner or later because there had been a pattern, and so she was going to find out sooner or later. So you know what? It's the first date. Why not? And so the date continued to go on long past the hour that they had set aside, and he laid out every reason to which they were never going to work, why he was incompatible and why all of the things fell apart. And she too said, well, these things fell apart in my world, and I'm really awful at this and awful at that, and these things aren't very well. These are really just awful things about me. After this long date, he dropped her off, and she about left the car and said, hey, we should do this again sometime. And he said, what, end it? Just And she said, yeah, this was fun. And so out of that birthed the particular song. And out of that song, the hook line in it is you kind of start with the ending. It's kind of the best place to begin in a lot of ways in our spiritual journey. What is the end point? I find that to be an interesting question. I don't ask myself, but like when my toddler and my 8-year-old are arguing, part of me goes like, what's the win here? Like, what are you trying to win? You're arguing, you're smacking each other. What's the win? And more often than that, it's this magical thing called control. You don't feel like you have control over something. You want to feel like you get a win. And who doesn't like to win? It's Super Bowl Sunday. Somebody's going to win because the game will not end in a tie. And half the people will be happy and the other half are going to be devastated. But the question is, what is the win? What's the ending? Because it makes the traverse ground a little bit more navigatable. If you don't know where you're going, then everything that you arrive at then becomes the thing. Then you move to the next thing. Now, I don't know about you, but that's kind of exhausting. Constantly having to battle the thing. It's an interesting reminder as my wife and I had a great time last night planning to build a house that, one, we can't afford. We can't even think about when we would move to it, when our children are ever going to leave our house, and maybe we don't want to build this house anywhere near here anyway. But it's an interesting exercise. Part because I think it reinforces the sermon, like, where do we want to be? It invites questions of, what do we want retirement to be like? Do we want to travel around? Well, then we don't want 7 dogs. Okay, well, if we have a dog, do we bring the dog with us? Maybe we need to have a dog now so we didn't get over the dog thing. Maybe have a dog later. It's beautiful because the daily conflicts and the daily grind then seem to be a lot less bigger. Because we have a goal, we have an idea of how we want our children to be raised. Well, how we think we want our children to be raised, and then, you figure it out. But it is also a reminder that when I wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning and one runs over here and goes, he hit my arm, and the other one goes, well, you pulled my thing, I'm going to miss that because this too shall pass. It is a reminder of starting with the ending to understand what happens in between. I'm going to try to pronounce this the best I can because I worked on it this morning for all of 10 minutes and then another 20 minutes. No, I'm going to, yeah. Help me? There you go. It's a fascinating new word that my wife gave to me this morning, which caused me to rewrite the end of my sermon because it works. It works because it's a good reminder. What is this big word that I should be able to pronounce, and now my brain's going blank again? I need more coffee. Well, essentially what it is when you get the most inept, incompetent, people that should never be in charge are now running your government. We do not have a republic, ladies and gentlemen. And I bring this up as a reminder of 2 key things. I was in college and I heard that if this president gets elected, it's all over. And you know what? It passed. And then the next guy was coming up and they said, if this guy gets elected, remember, this is the other side. If this guy gets elected, it's all over. We get to the next election cycle. The other side says, if this guy gets elected, it's... I feel like there's a theme and a pattern here. I'm not saying I like my choices in November at this particular point in time, but I also am reminded that this is our government, and this too. Not telling you who to vote for, how that's going to play out, because I don't know if it really matters anymore. I'm that pessimistic about my government's ability to respond to about anything, which is why I love the separation of church and state. I do. But at the same time, Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday happen to be stacked right on top of each other, which is a good reminder of all of these things. Ash Wednesday only has significance if we start with the ending. Why are we going down this journey? If we don't believe in resurrection, then why are we doing any of this? Why are we participating in any of this? It doesn't make sense. But we do have a destination, and that's Easter Sunday. And we got to go through Ash Wednesday and Lent and Maundy, Thursday, and Friday, and a burial and a waiting to Sunday. There is an ending. We start with the ending. But we do understand going through the valley of the shadow of death where I fear no evil because thy rod and thy staff are with me. Because this too shall pass. And while Valentine's Day is amazing, it's also a reminder of the many promises that people make to one another. I was going to ask Bobby, because it was kind of fascinating. They're celebrating their anniversary this week, I believe, or last week. 50 years, right? Older than I'm alive. I don't think I've stuck with anything my entire life. I don't think I've stuck with anything in 20 years. And yet 2 people can figure out a way to live that long. And some of you have also demonstrated something that I have no capacity whatsoever to entertain. And I would imagine that there probably were several conversations of, that doesn't mean every moment is like Valentine's Day. The honeymoon is over. But it's true, you find the strength to carry in relationships when a particular individual is going through their darkest moments. It's true that we have the idea of how do we want this to end. Because everything ends. The question is, how does it end? How do you want it to end? And then you find out what you start saying. You know what? This particular thing, this is just going to pass. I'm okay with this. I'm okay with the fact that there hasn't been under-cabinet lighting in our house for 5 years, and my wife has not left me yet. There are wires that dangle down. I just haven't gotten to it yet. I need 2 more days. 2 more days, and then it'll be done. It'll be fine. There's a door that's not quite totally painted to our playroom. My wife has not kicked me out or whatever. She could say, hey, you can't take a nap today. You got to paint that door. Somehow she keeps me around because I think I make coffee every morning, perhaps. But the Lenten journey and the Valentine's Day ideal is a reminder of the relationships that we share. Not something that becomes to the point where we think that it's always the idealistic thing. Might I remind you that Jesus walked off this mountain, and Peter had the ideal Valentine's Day celebration for Jesus. Everything's going to go my way. It's going to be happy. It's going to be bells and roses or whatever. And Jesus is walking off of that mountain, knowing what the ending is going to be. Having to walk all the way down to Jerusalem, to eventually be crucified on a cross, to be abandoned by every one of his friends, to go dormant, to be dead, to rely on God to resurrect him. I believe his "this too shall pass" is a lot harder than what I have to endure. But that's Jesus, Moses, and Elijah having the conversation about what is the ending. The prophets, the law, Jesus participating, and what do we want this ending to look like? So I leave you with that in a bit of a cliffhanger, because I want to invite you to think about how you want your Lenten journey to end. There's a few things that we have personally juggling. We're juggling with things as a church. We're juggling with things as a leadership team. How do we want this to end? Whether or not some of those things fall into the Let's pray.